Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Go Camp Pro. We've created and are dedicated to this podcast because we believe that staff training is one of, if not the most important part of your job as a camp director. Staff training is what prepares your staff to care for their kids, to feel confident in their skills, to do their jobs to the best of their ability, and to learn along the way. A well thought out and intentional staff training will help you in more ways than you can imagine. And we need to help each other bring our very best. So let's begin by sharing with you who we are. Ruby, can we get you to go first, please?
For sure. My name is Ruby Compton. I'm the Chief Exploration Officer for Ruby Outdoors. Just a fancy way of saying I'm self-employed, and I'm a freelance camp person who supports camps all over the world and whatever they need. Sometimes you just need a camp person, but specifically focus my efforts during the summer in Western North Carolina where I live.
Thanks, Ruby. And always you need a camp person, not
Always.
Just sometimes.
I was going to say the world needs a camp person, so yeah.
Always. And that was Gabrielle, so let's have her introduce herself.
Hey, Camp Coders. My name is Gabrielle Rail, and I'm one of the camp directors at Camp Waro. Camp Waro is an all-girls camp in the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec, Canada, and we focus on creating a positive female community so that young women and girls can do some good work inside of camp and outside of camp.
Thanks, Gab. And I'm Beth Allison. I'm co-owner of Camp Hacker and Go Camp Pro. I was a camp director, but now I have the privilege of working as a camp consultant. And my real focus and passion is intentional leadership training and helping all of our camps to build solid and supportive communities. Our topic today for our podcast is how to discuss Me Too at camp. And Ruby's going to tell us why we chose this topic.
So we're a couple of years out from when Me Too became a social media phenomenon and something that became part of our vernacular. And now that we're a couple years from when it first happened, it doesn't mean that it's just all solved now. There's still stuff to talk about and still good work to be done in how we move forward to create equitable workplaces and places where we can hopefully prevent the sorts of stories and experiences that we are hearing about that came out through that Me Too movement.
Thanks, Ruby. Now, before we dive in today, we just want to mention that we did a podcast about consent a few months back, which has some great tips and tricks to create an environment in which consent is just considered a normal part of your camp culture. So we encourage you to have a listen to that for more ideas too, if you haven't heard it already, or if you have, to go back and have a listen so you can make sure you're adding all these layers of support into your camp this summer. All right, so Ruby, let's start with you. What suggestions do you have for camp professionals seeking to have that dialogue about Me Too at their camps this summer?
Here's a thing that I think happens a lot in organizations, especially pre-Me Too happening, or Me Too coming to everyone's awareness, is we bring in the HR person, whoever that may be, to have the very serious sexual harassment talk. Everybody signs the document that says there will be no sexual harassment. And then everybody kind of feels not great, so we do something fun afterwards. And that's what we did. That's every camp that I ever worked at, an organization I worked at, that was how that went. And that's a step. And I think we are now positioned to do an even better job of creating spaces where our staff are working and our campers are living, that are equitable spaces, that are not hostile workplaces, that are places where people feel comfortable speaking up when boundaries have been crossed, or when they feel uncomfortable with something that somebody has said to them. And that can be because it's sexual in nature or degrading in nature, or just because it's something that rubs them the wrong way, right? I think about an experience that the three of us had where we were at a conference and we had been presenting for the morning. We took a break for lunch. And then we were in the room kind of just doing some prep and you know, regathering ourselves before the afternoon session happened while everybody was at lunch. And a guy who was middle-aged, also probably a camp director, came in from the room next door and he said, "Hey girls, any of you girls got some tape?" And we did have tape. But all three of us, I will say, in the moment had this like, like, we are professional women. Who are you to come in and say girls, right? And it was this like little microaggression that I really don't believe that the guy who said it had any intent to degrade us. And yet all three of us independently felt this like I could feel it between all of us. And yet none of us turned around and said, hey man, that was really uncool. And so we want to make sure that in our camp environments, that if people are having that moment, that there is some avenue for them to give feedback that moment happened for them. And you know what, at camp, we're probably going to have those moments. And I'm not even going to say it's terrible for those moments to happen, because there's opportunities for learning to happen too. But that is those moments, if there is an avenue for expressing yourself, if there's an avenue for a change to happen, if there is validation to those feelings. And so it's not good enough anymore to just say, yeah, we signed the sexual harassment policy and we went through that training. We have to create spaces where this sort of dialogue can happen. It's, I think, in a lot of ways very similar to how when I was, becoming a staff member, this idea of having a culture of accountability, where it's okay for you as a staff member who's a counselor, a first-year counselor, to turn around to the second-year counselor and say, hey man, what I just saw you do with that camper wasn't so cool. Or have you tried this way? Or I have an idea about how this could be better. And I think as kind of commonplace and okay and respectful as that can happen, we can have conversations around topics even as intense and emotional and scary as the conversations that we're having around Me Too, and making sure that folks feel the empowerment and the agency to step up and say, something's not okay right now, or this is triggering me on an experience I've had in the past, and what can we do to prevent any of our campers from having experiences like this, and any of our staff from having experiences like this at camp.
Thanks, Ruby. It was a great start. And for those of you who can't see her, but only can listen to her, Ruby always does this podcast standing up at her desk. And she is on fire right now. She is bouncing on her heels. So obviously very passionate about this incredibly important topic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's great to see the passion come through. So if you cannot see her, I'm just letting you know that that's what's going on in the background. Gab, what have you got to share with us?
I think the thing with Me Too, what has evolved is fear and confusion, and I don't want to get in trouble mentality. And what's unfortunately has evolved is not only just a Me Too situation, but a me versus us situation. And I think when we're talking to our staff members, we want to tell them that what we're trying to do is not to make anybody afraid. What we're trying to do is to make everybody feel safer and more comfortable, and bring in your staff members in on the goal of what you're trying to do. And safer is always better than hiding our feelings. And when it comes to Me Too, I think this was such a big shock to 50% of our society, and not a big shock to the other 50% of our society. And I think that's the reconciliation that we're doing right now, is the piece of, this has been happening, it is not okay, but also because we haven't had a space in the past to talk about it, because it wasn't taken seriously, we weren't able necessarily to educate perhaps the other half. And of course, I'll include women in the other half as well. Of course, there are men that are completely aware, and of course, there are women that aren't aware. It depends on your circle of people that you talk to. But our goal is, now we have an opportunity because of Me Too, not to avoid and not to be afraid, but it gives us a platform to have a conversation. And the whole goal about Me Too is to say, this happens all the time, consistently. And so now that we know that there's an issue as camp professionals, we have an opportunity to talk about it. And we have an opportunity with ourselves to create a culture of communication, open communication. We have an opportunity to create a culture of open communication where we're we're choosing to communicate over not offending, meaning that person that did come into the room with Beth, Ruby, and myself and called us girls multiple times. And you know, I didn't want to make him uncomfortable. I didn't want to make Beth and Ruby uncomfortable. We weren't going to see this person again. It wasn't somebody that we were going to, you know, connect with, you know, throughout the time. And you know, as women, or you know, we choose sometimes to not say these things because we've have said those things in the past and it didn't go over very well. So we're choosing to have these conversations that will be uncomfortable, but what do we do with that uncomfortableness? And I think that one of the first things that we're saying is we want uncomfortable over silence. And that's the type of community we're aiming for. And we're going to practice that together during staff training. And it is going to be difficult because we're one of the first generations that is actually creating an open conversation. Whereas in past generations, what was done is created rules and laws, which are very important to have. You need to have those to feel safe. But now we have an opportunity to create those conversations, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but we're going to do that together. And what do we want to look like? And as I often say, I like to look at my staff members, and I like to bring them in on the conversation. And not all of my staff members, we have 70 staff members. So I do start with 5 or 6 or 7 staff members. And I start with the ones that are influencers within our group. And we talk about the opportunity. And because our camp is already set up, just like your camp, the goal is to have not just a bigger impact, an impact within your camp, but outside of your camp. The greater mission is to impact our communities in a positive way. So it starts with us. And we have an opportunity to do that here and now.
Can I add to that, Gabs, though, what you said about policies and procedures? Yes, we need them. And what you're saying is we need to create that dialogue, because that's what really sets culture. And if I think about, you know, when I drive in different cities, right, there's always a speed limit, but there are places where it is observed more than others. And that is the culture. And that's the dialogue. Right. That is not just through the enforcement of the policy, it's also through the dialogue and the conversation and the culture of that place.
Great. Thank you both. Now, you may be understandably nervous about how to handle this subject at camp, and that's okay. There are lots of subjects at camp that we need to talk about that can make people uncomfortable and sometimes even upset, and this is no different. So for me, we first need to be sure that we create a community built on trust that allows for these kinds of discussions. So as camp leaders, we need to be stepping up to join the Me Too conversation and take advantage of the opportunities we have during training for dialogue that can positively impact our organizations and work to help eliminate sexual harassment, discrimination of all kinds. Both of those issues for me boil down to respect. And camps with a culture of respect are going to be more successful in their efforts to create this kind of community. So for me, working year-round with your people to develop this kind of environment, a community of respect, is where we want to be putting all of our energy, not just for the Me Too conversations and the issues, but for all things. And of course, especially for this particular conversation. I mean, we are relational beings, and the best way for our people to connect with one another and do great things together is with that culture of respect. And again, we have a number of episodes that we've done over the seasons that talk about ways in which we can do this. So I'm just going to leave that there for now. So for me, first thing is to create that community of trust. And then the second thing, as you've already heard these two brilliant women say, is to make the space. Set your people up for success like you do with all things at camp, and change starts with conversation. So I would begin by talking with my staff during training about sex discrimination. What is it? What does it look like? And how could it be affecting your camp in the wake of Me Too? Men and women need to be able to openly discuss what is and is not unwelcome, non-consensual, discriminatory conduct. We have to take the lead in starting and being really supportive of this conversation. So work on building that culture of respect, and then create space for these kinds of discussions. And I would just very practically front load, of course, your policies before people get to camp so that they know your boundaries, that they feel safer coming to work for you. Maybe not completely safe, but certainly a little bit safer because they see that it's in there and you're going to talk about it, and that they will know that you take these kinds of issues really seriously. I would also at this time take time to think strategically about a focused plan surrounding diversity, inclusion, and equality in your camp. And if you've already got one, then now is the time this spring to sort of take a look at it, retweak it, revise it, revisit it. This plan should include, I think, really effective training, but also empowerment of your people and leadership. So I would follow 3 steps to kind of give us some structure. And the first step, shockingly, on Camp Code is training. So that can be one of the first steps to institute cultural change, but it has to be done right, and it has to be current with the times and with the laws, whatever those happen to be in your state or province. So we do need to run at least one session on this topic and have all of your staff participate in it. We simply, as Ruby said at the beginning, can't solely rely on policies and staff handbooks that merely fulfill compliance requirements. We have to ensure, yes, that our staff handbook has a clear policy on sexual harassment, and that that policy is available to everybody. And, you know, some of the things we did used to do can still be used, like having, making sure you wait for this session till everybody's present, if not everyone arrives at the same time, and having people state, sign a document that they participated in the training, but it can't just be that. So I would front load this session that you're going to do with your staff by saying things like, we need to be okay with being uncomfortable. We need to listen, listen, listen. We need to be okay to leave for a little bit and come back. We don't know who's been through what. So I always had my leadership team prepared to quietly follow the person leaving out, just to make sure they're okay, see if they need a moment alone or if they need some support. Because of the importance and sensitivity of this kind of training, I would recommend that once you've introduced the topic, you need to provide your people time in smaller groups and face-to-face. So I want you to remember this if you're doing some of your training before you get to camp. Staff need to be able to listen, to hear, and to share some of their thoughts and concerns, and to talk openly about strategies they feel can help camp to be a safer place. And if you send staff videos or webinars on the topic, there's always a chance that they can easily tune out what's being said, even if they actually do watch them. And if we're working on building that community of respect, having the opportunity for mature and honest discussion is key. I think that one of the many concerns about this topic is that there are so many personal experiences and feelings that go along with it. Some of your staff may have lived through a Me Too experience. Some of them may have been accused of inappropriate behavior, fairly or not. Some may become incredibly stressed about how to talk to other staff members so they don't say or do the wrong thing. So we need to allow time during our session to ask people to put themselves in another person's shoes. So an idea that I came up with was to ask them to help you come up with categories of people who may be sitting in the room right now. So for lack of better words, survivors or accused, or people who are just stressed about it, or people who are like just confused about the issue. They don't know how to act or to be around other staff members. So then you can ask them to choose one of these categories that does not apply to them and find their group. And if the groups are too big, you can self-divide within that category. And then ask the groups to discuss how this particular category of people that they don't personally associate with might be feeling, how life may have changed for them, what concerns they might have. It's really easy to get defensive in these kinds of conversations, especially if you feel like you're being unfairly grouped into a category, which could be anything from, I don't know, like predatory males or people who are insensitive or people who are overly sensitive, whatever. So spend some time in the session asking staff to think about what it could be like for the other person. And this act of asking people to think about how others might feel can help to create some understanding and some empathy. And then later in that session with staff, I would have small groups talk about ways that they can cultivate this culture of respect. So in a large group debrief, that we did one of my last year's directing, my staff shared their small group answers to questions like, how do we stand up for one another? And my staff told me things like, we're not going to laugh at inappropriate jokes. We need to work with respect for both men and women. There shouldn't be a way that you act with a male that's different from the way you act with a female staff person. I think it's really important for us to have these kinds of conversations at camp, because we need to talk about what we stand for, what's acceptable, and what isn't. And to go back to that point that Ruby was talking about earlier, one of the things we decided as a staff was to try to have conversations in real time. So if you're not sure somebody has said or done something inappropriate, to use your voice, to ask that person to clarify why they said what they said, telling them you're not sure what they meant by that. We are all human and we can make mistakes, and we can then forgive each other. But when these things do happen, we need to empower our staff to be able to see it, to say it, to be clear and in the moment. Another question that came up for us was, what are ways you can protect yourself from getting into an awkward position where comments could be misconstrued? So, they had answers for those kinds of things, which were really helpful. A successful training session should also cover, for me, the key components of that harassment policy that you have, and any additional state or province mandated guidelines, and to share with your staff that process for how things would be investigated, how complaints would come into you, how both parties would be treated throughout the process. I think it's important staff hear these answers now, so that they know what happens, what are the very specific steps in place. And if you can, I would visually show that, or walk everybody through it, or do a scenario with a really mature and seasoned staff member who would play it right. Staff will learn a lot more about this subject and the camp you're trying to create together if there's this open and upfront dialogue. And if people understand the why behind it and how you deal with any of the concerns and what the process is, that can alleviate some tension and help them to treat each other with some kindness and concern. So I would start there and think about how you can do this during training, and ways that will help your staff feel like they can have these open and honest dialogues, and have some ability to speak up.
And I think what I really liked, Beth, where you talked about, or the way I'm interpreting it, is small shifts make big differences. So having those conversations of what are certain small shifts we can do. So how I treat my particular gender should be the same way I treat perhaps the opposite gender, if that's the case. And I think that for the activity of empathy, I think that's really, really neat. And I think that that's something I would reserve for a group that you're very familiar with, and that is perhaps a smaller group that might lead other staff members. Because again, if we don't know the level of certain individuals' past experiences, putting themselves in the circle of somebody that was perhaps wrongly accused, we know that this is wrongly accused is it's sensitive, because a lot of wrongly accused is being brought up as a lot of fear, that what if I'm wrongly accused? This is actually quite rare that happens, and something that has gone through a Me Too experience, this is can be triggering. But I think it is important to explore how misunderstandings can happen, and I think with a mature group, I think this is really important. And when we're looking at this, I think that's how you approach this, is what are the different layers and levels that you can do with different people within your organization. All of this needs to be discussed. All of this has to be explored, but not every single individual needs to go through the same process. So your leadership team members, your managerial staff, the way we talk to them about this is going to be different than our frontline staff. So I think I really appreciate looking at that level of training with your staff members.
Great, and those are really good points, absolutely. Ruby, what else have you got there?
A few things. Where to start? Okay. The word fear has come up a bunch in this conversation, and I think this is a nice place to remind us to not let fear be in the driver's seat. It's part of the conversation, but we can't let it drive our decisions, because decisions made purely by fear, when we are not like literally under attack by a tiger, are generally not the best decisions long term. So, and to also understand that when we have that fear response, like that is our body triggering, like we are being chased like a tiger. And so to take that moment to go, no tigers in the room, just some uncomfortable conversation that I'm I'm not excited about facilitating, or all the way up to like, this tiger is actually a trigger and I need to acknowledge that. All of that is okay, but just recognize that as much as possible, we don't want to let fear be in the driver's seat. I think also remembering when we're talking about this to be conscientious if we're facilitating a conversation about Me Too and how we treat genders, that we use all-inclusive gender language, so it's all genders, and we're not always setting up the person who is doing the harassment to always be male, or to always be older, right? That we want to make sure that we are presenting the case that this could happen anywhere, and with anyone, and whatever the identity is, this sort of conduct, no matter who it's against, is not acceptable. Something else that was said earlier, which, oh gosh, like there's been some really good nuggets already in this. Who said it? We want uncomfortable over silence, and we will practice that during training. Gabs, you said that. And I think it's important to dig into that idea a little bit, because there are times at camp that we want to be comfortable with silence, right? That it's okay for silence to happen. And in fact, we want to encourage our staff to encourage that with campers. But it's when you start like feeling the hot feeling in your face, or your belly starting to churn, like these are moments where you need to recognize this is an uncomfortable, like your body is trying to tell you something. And it's important that we take that feeling and express some words to it. And those words may be, hey, I need to talk to somebody, or hey, I need a minute, or hey, this is what I'm feeling right now. So I would put that caveat onto that. I love that sentence though, like we want uncomfortable over silence. I think that's a really great phrase to remember for facilitating any of these kind of conversations. And also to remember that in these conversations, I think another thing to remember is that putting out there that this can be a brave space, right? And being brave sometimes looks like stepping back and being quiet and listening, and letting other people talk. And that if you are the one who's usually the lead in the room, being brave may mean being quiet. And for the folks who tend to not speak up as often, being brave may look like standing up and speaking. So recognizing that. I believe I've talked about this tool before, but the idea of intent versus impact is really helpful in conversations around, everything in the world, but especially when we're talking about, you did something and it had this impact on me, and that person goes, well, I didn't mean it that way. I was just telling you a joke, right? And so to just even have the language introduced to your staff, this idea of my intent was to joke around, and now I recognize that the impact was you were hurt and frustrated and upset, and that there can be a disconnect between the two. And the other thing to remember with that is it doesn't mean one is more right than the other. It doesn't mean that the person that was hurt is more right than the person who was joking around. It just means that it was experienced differently. And so to see that there is a disconnect there, that will allow some space for conversation that hopefully will feel less personal. And it's not, you made me feel uncomfortable. It's I feel uncomfortable. And I recognize that the intent here was to make a joke. Right. So it's a really powerful tool for working through some conflict. So please equip your staff with that idea. And the other thing that I want to say is I have been really impressed, and I think it's one of the reasons that I said, hey, I think we should do another podcast about this, because Southwest has added into their safety speech, if you are paying attention, when they start talking about buckling the seatbelts and, the flotation device. They've also included a line now that something to the effect of, if you feel uncomfortable with any conduct of any other passenger on this aircraft, please let one of the flight attendants know. And so we already use that aircraft language in camp, where we're talking about putting on our oxygen masks before other people and, all that sort of stuff. I think that's another great sentiment that and statement actually that we need to be saying at camp, and maybe saying it very frequently, because I don't think you just say it once and it gets heard and people are good to go to understand that you can actually speak up if something is making you uncomfortable. And that word uncomfortable has come up a lot, and I think something we've talked about on this podcast before is this idea of like, what's the difference between uncomfortable and anxious and fear and depression, right? Like, where are the lines between all of these? It may be worth having some conversation around those, and that's where using that camper inception technique that we love so much on here can be helpful, is to say, like, how might a camper express fear? How might a camper express uncomfortable? How might a camper express anxiety? And what levels of that are good at camp, and what levels of that do we need to do some interventions, and like, we don't want to push them to those spaces. So yeah, the next time you're on a Southwest flight, listen for that language, because I think it's a good add to their business.
Great. Thanks, Ruby. Gab, anything else you've got to add there?
Yeah, I think when what Ruby's talking about language, and I think when she's distinguishing between fear and anxiety, the more we use these languages and the more we get staff to express what they are feeling. So when they say I'm afraid, ask them more details of what does afraid mean to you. What is that experience like? And it's okay as a support person to say, for me, this sounds more like X, Y, and Z, or, oh, this is what fear means to you. And the more we do this with our staff and our campers, the more the vocabulary and precision we're going to have to deal with nuances. And this isn't, shifting your culture, as we all know, doesn't happen overnight, doesn't happen over a summer either. And this is why, and I often talk about this, but this is why I really believe in teaching our campers to use I statements. I feel, I think, I believe, when it comes with interacting with other campers and training your staff members on how to do it. And of course, the inception piece is when you're training staff members on how to lead campers in I statements, they're learning how to do that too. And so when it comes to intent versus impact, if it is a joke scenario, then it tends to be less defense happens. So, Ruby, the joke that you made, it made me feel this way. And instead of saying, you did this to me, automatically our defenses go down. But I think, moreover, this is a long process, and that because a lot of people haven't had an opportunity to talk about Me Too, haven't had an opportunity to talk about what it's like to be harmed, to be hurt, unintentionally or intentionally. We're looking at a lot of intense feelings, and I think that I like to tell my staff members when we're approaching these type of conversations that this is not a place to talk about your personal experiences. That if you feel it's important for your job, for a leadership team member or myself to know, we can talk about that. If you feel that this session is too overwhelming or triggering for you, we can discuss your participation level. Of course, you may leave, all of these aspects, but in a group setting, sometimes this is when people start sharing their experiences, and what sometimes happens with people that have been assaulted, when they do share in a large group, there's another layer of reharm that happens afterwards, and we don't necessarily want that, and we're not equipped necessarily to deal with that. So letting them know just that piece, I think, is very helpful, especially with young adults, because they do tend to enjoy to share their personal stories and their personal experiences, and that's why I love them, and I think they're amazing. But in this case, it's not necessarily safe. It's not necessarily safe for them. It's not necessarily safe for the other individuals in the room, because they might not know how to handle it. And this is us teaching them how to work with their experiences, and that there is a place for it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a touchy subject, but it's something that we all have to manage, and manage with care.
Great, thanks, Gab. And I agree, and I think one of the reasons some of those stories do come out at camp is because they do feel safer at camp maybe than they have elsewhere, and they feel supported, and so then they feel that they can have those kinds of conversations. So again, it is about front loading before you start to sit down and do some of this in training. And I was thinking about the little exercise I was talking about earlier, and your suggestions, Gab, is also, and I would have front loaded it had I done it with a whole group of people, but that, you're finding a category that you can fit under that doesn't apply to you, but don't choose one that's really triggering. Like, there will be
Right.
other options,
Exactly.
but to front load with them, not to choose one. For example, if you have experienced a Me Too moment, at least one, most of us have experienced more than one, but don't pick someone who's been accused, pick something else, so that it's not going to be such a difficult conversation, but we can just try to get a little more understanding out there. So for me, as I said, training was number one. The other two are not quite as lengthy, but one is longer. Well, both of them are probably longer term than training. But the second step for me is empowerment. And we've talked a little bit about this already, but just educating people about it isn't enough. It's really crucial that camps not only outline what policies are regarding harassment, but we have to be sure that our staff feel and are empowered to act as well. And we have talked a little bit about the fact that people don't always feel comfortable speaking up. So we want to be sure that our staff know that they have options available to them. And we also need to empower each other to call out one another on uncomfortable behaviors, which Ruby was talking about. So maybe during some training time, you can ask staff to share in small groups or with partners of how we can point out uncomfortable behaviors in a kind and respectful way that helps support our camp mission, but that still gets the point across. And then decide together maybe on some of the language that people can use to share some of their feelings. So my staff and I talked about the fact that the conversation will always go more smoothly if you can give that person the benefit of the doubt and regularly remind yourself that this is a tough topic to talk about for anyone. But when you hear something that you think is off base, they decided they didn't want to just jump down somebody's throat immediately, but they wanted to look for ways that they could continue the discussion about it. So saying things like, they came up with, I think you may have been mistaken there, or I have a different perspective. But also, I think Ruby's intent versus impact is absolutely brilliant. And so just giving them that kind of language, because I think it's hard for them sometimes to choose the right words in the moment. So it might help them to think about how they might respond in different types of statements, and then have them practice in pairs. I think it can be uncomfortable and awkward, and they're going to hate it, but you're going to front load all of that with them, but it will help and let them know that these are skills that they can use not only at camp, but in any workplace. And having those discussions together, I think, can further empower them. I would also make sure when you are talking about this and those kinds of sessions are over, that they know exactly who they can go to if they are feeling unsafe at your camp. And you need to name a number of people, not just one. And you need to be clear who they speak to if you make them feel uncomfortable or unsafe. It sounds really prickly and really awful, but they need to know that you've put their safety and well-being ahead of everything else, and that they always have options if they are ever feeling uncomfortable or unsafe. And I also think that you have to leave time at the end of the session for follow-up questions or concerns. And if you don't have time, then you need to set aside time at another point during training and tell them then and there, we have to run, we have to do this other thing, but we will come back and address questions later. And maybe you could even plant one or two of your staff members to have a question ready so others feel that it's okay. And also come up with another way, like, do you have a question box or some other place if people are feeling like they don't want to raise their hand and ask that concern? I think that's really important. And then the third thing for me would be to lead by example. And of course, like anything at camp, empowerment will only happen if the leadership embodies its core values and sets an example. So we can't just say that we have a policy and then ignore when people are made to feel uncomfortable or unsafe, or to just brush it off. And this has to go across the board with every staff member, no matter their level of leadership at camp. We cannot say things like, he grew up in a different time, so it's okay for him to say that because he doesn't quite understand it, or she. And I've run into that situation. So I think to truly create a workspace of respect, we need to take action with all of our staff members. The Me Too conversation has sparked a shift in how we view harassment in the workplace, and this includes camp. And I think that we're going to find that staff are not willing to sit by and tolerate this anymore, most of our staff anyway. So we need to make sure that we front load our policies before we hire them. We need to talk about it openly during training, and we need to create those pathways for staff to reach out and be supported all the way through the year, not just during the summer. And of course, training needs to cover other issues too, like diversity and inclusion and effective communication and unconscious bias, and how to understand that, and anti-discrimination and retaliation. And of course, not all this should happen in one day, but I think that if we can have these conversations and points of discussion, we can cultivate a mindset of mutual respect and understanding. Anything else either one of you would like to add before we sign off for today?
I have one more story. Can I tell a story?
Please.
Yes.
So I worked at a big YMCA camp in Nashville when I was in college, and worked my way up. I was a counselor and program staff, and then worked my way up to a head counselor, and then kind of like an assistant camp director, but seasonally. And I may have told this story on the podcast before. I'm going to tell it again because we have a lot of episodes and you may not have heard it. But there was this one particular summer where, so every morning, all the kids came into our chapel area, our amphitheater, and we sang songs and, you know, did activities. And there was always kind of like a lesson of the day. And it was our gathering time. But that was where I learned crowd control and how to like get 700 people amped about something. And so we would have cheering competitions, and we'd have songs where they'd be like, all right, who can sing louder? And we had different groups based on the ages, you know, so we had this group, it was the 4th and 5th graders, and can you guys be louder than these guys, right? And we'd do that. But there was one particular year that we were doing a song that there were parts, and we were trying to see who was louder, that this thing kind of spontaneously happened where one of our male directors would just start chanting and be like, all right, we're going to do girls versus boys, men, 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 men. I would just chant that to the point that like there was this whole space of, you know, 700 people where like 400 of them are chanting men, men, men. And it made me uncomfortable. And I don't know if it's, I won't chalk it up to anything, but I will chalk it up a little bit to my, you know, all girls high school education, where I was like, this is not okay. Like, right, this is not okay. This is uncomfortable. Is anybody else uncomfortable? I'm uncomfortable. So I remember going to my boss and being like, hey man, this is not okay. We need to find something else. But I'm even okay with it being like, all right, boys, girls, because we weren't having as much of this being more inclusive with gender discussion. Like that wasn't even on the table yet. So I was like, it's fine if we're having the boys and girls compete, but we can't just be like chanting med. Like I feel uncomfortable about sending kids home at the end of the day. This is a day camp too. And they're like, what'd you do today? I chanted men, 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 right? This is something, I don't know, there's something not right about it. And I'll be honest, he laughed at me about it. And he was like, I think you are taking this too seriously. I don't think it's a big deal. And that was where it really sparked for me that I was like, that's not okay. The fact that that my feelings about this are not being accepted. And some of my argument was like, but we don't have anything to chant back. We can't be like, ladies, ladies. Like it just doesn't have the same feel. It's just is not a good situation. And I harped on him for about a week and just every day was like, this really makes me uncomfortable. I don't think we should do it. And he finally gave in, and I finally had the opportunity to go tell one of my head counselors, who was one of my staff that summer, because he was like the first follower. Anytime the men chant started, he was always the very first person like chiming in on it. And I remember going to him and just being like, hey man, like we're not going to do that anymore. He was like, I don't understand why. I said, it makes me really uncomfortable. And I think there are probably other people in the room that it's making really uncomfortable as well. And I'm the one who's willing to say it. And he was like, okay. And we changed from there. So what's funny is I think about that conversation happened, 10, 15 years ago. I think that whole dynamic would play out very differently now. And I think it probably wouldn't happen in the first place. And if it did, I think the conversation would be understood a lot more. So these times are a changing. is the point of that story. Thank you. All right. Good night.
I also think that you are creating division by doing
Yeah.
those. And then, I mean, I'm not saying that everything at camp can't have competition in some way, shape, or form, but what we're trying to do is build understanding of other genders and how they're feeling, and not the other way. So I can see, again, today that probably be very different, but I can see where you're coming from for sure. Gab, anything else you want to add, or are you good there?
I just want to say that I feel that for those of you that are listening to this, thank you so much. For those of you that have friends that are in the camp industry and are still saying, you know, well, camp is so nice, like camp people are so great, this never happens at camp, have them listen to this podcast, because camp is great and camp is amazing, but we're amazing because we're intentional, and we can't hide behind the word camp, the name camp. We have to say, we have to hold camp up. We have to hold camp accountable. And when we hold camp accountable, then we're leaders within our communities. So there are definitely, you know, camp is a wonderful, beautiful place, but we have to bring our friends in on this conversation, so that we can continue making it that way. And of course, you know, that's our responsibility. So I just want to say thank you to the people that are listening to this. And Ruby, I never heard this story, so maybe I did, and I don't remember.
I think,
but I love it.
I don't ever remember hearing the story either.
Okay,
so.
good.
Well, then there you
I
go.
think one reason, if you take nothing else from that story, like maybe that can be a story that you tell at camp as a training scenario, and be like, is this okay? You know, and like start some conversation around it. So yeah, I just remember feeling very personal. And I think part of it was too, it was one of the first times that I really stood up for something in that job, where I was just like, I really, like, core of core, my belly feels like this is not okay, and we need to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Great.
100%.
I think my last tip would be, you probably should not run a session like this alone. You should probably have all of your genders represented in the leadership of this particular session. I'm picturing as someone who identifies as a woman sitting in a session about Me Too being run by someone who identifies as a male, and not having someone up there who identifies like I do. So I would consider certainly having other people help you run this particular conversation, because some staff may find it hard to hear from you how they may feel. So just kind of keep that in the back of your minds, and also make sure you are continuously educating yourself on the standard policies and evolving attitudes about this very sensitive subject. It cannot be, as we said at the beginning, something that goes in your staff handbook and you check it off. We owe our staff better than that. And of course, our campers as well. So Gab, recap time.
Okay, so we're going to be using the framework of Beth's framework, which is train, empowerment, and lead by example, which ironically spells the word, not ironically, but in a positive way, tell. Isn't that beautiful? Thank you, Beth. I don't know if you planned that,
it.
but
I did not, actually.
Oh, whatever. You know what, your subconscious is,
there you go.
on to you. So when it comes to training, let's first and foremost talk about front loading. Before you hire individuals, let them know what your policies and procedures are. This is essential for giving them agency in choosing your organization, and also understanding that this is what's going to be required for them. And that might make them feel really, really good. So they'll feel positive about going to your organization. Make sure that your paper is up to date, policy and procedures, and not only the paper aspect. When they get to camp, go over it in detail so that they understand what will happen if there is an incident within your organization. What does it look like? What does it sound like? And what are the consequences? And again, this is all about creating a safer space for everybody. When it comes to training, we'll not talk about this once. We'll be talking about this together throughout staff training and throughout the summer. It's about building community, everybody. That's what we're trying to do. And we're going to try to do that by first inviting our inner circle of staff members in on that conversation to help us navigate as camp directors how we want to move forward with this training. You also probably want to look at multi-layered training when you're looking at your leadership team, your kitchen staff, your maintenance team, and then of course your frontline staff. What is the message that you're giving them? How are you presenting this information, and how does it apply to their jobs? When it comes to continuing training, let's look at creating trust. How do we deal with gasp moments? What kind of language we'll be using then? Also, language intent versus impact. Maybe think about training your staff members on I statements and having them help their campers use I statements when dealing with conflict with other campers. That's going to set them up to be amazing staff members because they're already going to have those skills as they get older.
And intent and impact are I statements. So that works right in there.
Look at that. That's our next book. We have so many books to write. We're here to change our culture and not just change documents. And that's what we're trying to bring our staff members in. We want them to be part of the dialogue. We know that this is going to be uncomfortable, and silence is sometimes uncomfortable, but we want to have uncomfortable experiences so we can have that conversation. Thank you to the people before us that created these laws and regulations. Now it has provided us a space to actually do even better. And it's not just for us as staff members, and it's not about legal rights, though that's important. It is also about creating a safer space for our campers and for our staff members, and creating a positive change within our community, which brings me back to lead by example. When it comes to leading by example, I do not care if your chef has been there for 28 years and he is amazing. He is not from a different time, though maybe he is. He also has to learn the ways of your organization. This is extremely important. If they cannot follow your new ways of being respectful to each other, this individual has to go. And I know because I work at a family organization, and we have fired family members before. It is not a family camp unless you fired a family member before. Family members have to be on board, and your 28 years on staff also have to be on board. We are a place of community, not a place of one person because they've been there for a long time. Make sure that you also have different gendered individuals that are leading different types of conversation, and we are not above all. Therefore, if they have an issue with you, who can they go talk to? It cannot just be one person, it must be multiple people. And that is our recap for today.
Wow, well done.
Incredible.
We should end it right there, Gab, because nothing more needs to be said. Here's how you can get involved and join us on Camp Code. So you use the hashtag Camp Code and let us know the topics you'd like to discuss, any guests you recommend that we talk to, and great leadership training tips that you have to share with us. We would love to hear from you, and sharing in this industry is just what makes us all better. And if you have found this podcast to be useful, we would love it if you could leave us a rating and a review for us in iTunes. And you can do that by going to camphacker.tv/cc_iTunes, or you can tweet your love of the show by going to camphacker.tv/campcodelove. We would really appreciate it. And here is how you can contact each one of us individually. Ruby.
You can email me, ruby@rubyoutdoors.com. You can also find me on Instagram at rubyoutdoors, and find me on Twitter at rubylyn85.
Thanks. And Gab?
You can contact me via Facebook or Instagram at Gabrielle Rail. Rail has 2 L's, and you can also check out where I work at ouareau.com, ouareau.com.
Perfect. Thank you. Our website is gocamp.pro. You can email me directly at beth@gocamp.pro, and on Instagram as Topaz Faye. Ruby, our next podcast is?
I forgot. What is it? Do we have it set?
She was so...
I was all my eggs were in today's basket.
How do we save the camp industry?
It's going to be a surprise. Our next podcast will be a surprise. If you're just listening to this later, this is the week that everything has hit the fan with
Yes.
COVID-19. So we're impressed we got this far. So we will let you know what the next podcast will be. It will be a surprise, and this way we're not tied down to anything. We can pick whatever we like. Okay.
There'll be another one, though. We're going to make that commitment.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
We already have our date set.
We need to hang out for emotional wellness. I need this podcast, so there will be another one.
Oh, dear. Our final segment on each podcast is a best practice for leadership training. And again, of course, we'd love to hear from you, some of your most memorable moments or most effective tips. We would love to hear those from you. And this week, Ruby has our best practice.
I do have that. Okay. So I've done a bunch of training this winter about communication and teaching and working with your team and managing up and managing down and delegation. And it all comes down to this idea. Are you ready? I want to challenge you to choose to communicate rather than to assume. Choose to communicate rather than to assume. It applies to the conversation we had today, that when you feel something is unsettling or you have questions about it, or you're like, man, what a jerk, I can't believe they did that, right? That's a feeling that you're having, and that is actually an assumption that they're a jerk. They may come across as a jerk, but let's lean into it and say, hey, wow, I didn't like how that landed. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that statement? Pretty much anytime conflict arises at camp, often a miscommunication is at the root of it. Often, not always, but often. And so if we will lean into conversations and rather, anytime we feel ourselves making assumptions and even making judgments, if we will then instead try to lean in and communicate, ask questions, be curious, then we can head off a lot of these conflicts, or at least handle them in a more respectful manner.
Thanks, Ruby. That's great. So that wraps things up for today. Let's share our challenges and our successes, and together camp can lead the change in the world that we need. Thanks for the listening, friends.